Hey everyone, I'm JD Fiscus, and I have been a principal and director of different types of AI teams, including labs, ops, and governance. And so I wanted to look at my predictions for 2026. And if we take a look at this first slide, we're going to see the problem AI cost gravity. And what this means is we're seeing a lot of different spending from enterprises that's exploding. And what we're starting to see is that this is driven by the proprietary API contracts, which basically means that you use one type of LLM and you're kind of tied to it from then on. And this is really difficult, especially when we're seeing things like different models that are coming out, whether they be open source or even changes in the model on the systems themselves. So we can kind of see things like different proprietary annual costs of like 100K or more. And so that brings me to my first prediction. And that if we look at this next slide, what we're going to see is that I think small language models are actually going to start to win in production. There's a huge market that is actually increasing in this. So we're seeing like a 28.7% increase of how this AI segment is actually faster. So when we look at things like Phi or even IBM Granite, you start to see that these smaller billion parameter models actually have really good performance. And we're looking at different types of tasks that we might be able to do with these types of systems. We're really seeing that like you don't need a PhD level LLM for every single task. And as a result, you can start using these smaller models, these open source models, and drastically reduce your costs. The next slide goes through this prediction of AI in the browser. So I've been covering this a lot on my Nerding.io channel, which is more of a deep technical dive, where you can actually use in the browser today something called WebGPU. That's standard across all different types of browsers, whether it be Firefox, Chrome, whatever. And you can use a framework called Transformers.js, which actually allows you to load in different models directly into the browser. So you can actually leverage this for different things. You can think about the fact that you could use JavaScript to actually handle some of your user experience in an AI way, and also keep things, fast, local, private, where you're not actually sending PHI or PII information back to the back end. The other thing that I think we're going to see is in the next slide go over open source embedding. And what that means is when you think about when you're doing a RAG system, or you actually need to train on your code base, or you have sensitive information that you want to be indexed into an LLM so that you can kind of search and reuse it, what happens is two different things. Those embeddings are different between different types of systems. So if you're using OpenAI for an embedding, you are now stuck with OpenAI. If you're using something like Mistral or Claude, same type of thing. You're actually stuck with those models unless you want to rerun them. They're also one of the most expensive things to actually run in that type of LLM. So I really think what we're going to start to see is we'll see more and more of these open source embeddings starting to go mainstream, where whenever you're trying to save your information for your business or for your code base, you're actually going to run that type of embedding or RAG through some level of open source. There's things like Quen, but really the biggest player that I've seen in all of the open source models is been Google. So Google has been releasing a ton of models. I mean, even in December, they released two different models. So you had function Gemma, you had embeddings Gemma, all around like the Gemma model. We've even seen that the Apple Foundation model, is actually going to be using Google as part of how they actually leverage their models. So to me, this idea of paying for these more expensive proprietary models, I think is going to start to go down. And in the next slide, I'll look at my fourth prediction, which is MCP becomes infrastructure. And what I mean by this is MCP actually grew to the point where there's 5,500 MCP servers already. There's like 20,000 implementations on GitHub. But a lot of these are either lacking security. So there's a 53%, not necessarily a vulnerability, but they're using static API keys in order to authenticate. So the governance is kind of lagging there. But also, a lot of these tools or a lot of these MCPs are actually just using tools. So what a tool is it is essentially a function that allows this MCP, which is a protocol, to communicate with your AI. So the LLM communicates to the MCP, and then the MCP communicates to the API or to a data source or whatever. But there's also other varying parts of MCP that have been underutilized: resourcing, sampling, elicitation, um, and a lot of these things are actually being kind of rebranded. So we're starting to see things with like OpenAI and Claude, where basically you're seeing what's called a connector, and that connector allows you to connect to different types of tooling. You can connect to Google Drive, you could connect to Jira, you could connect to Canva, and it allows your LLM to actually control these types of services. Well, that connector is using something called OAuth to authenticate through, which is one of the ways that MCP is now starting to transition away from API keys into more of an OAuth factor. And it's something that you use every day. So whenever you log into Google and say like, oh, or I want to log in with Google to a different site, that's using OAuth. The other reason that I think MCP is going to be so critical is things like it was donated to the Linux Foundation, but we're also seeing things in like OpenAI where those ChatGPT apps are all written in MCP. So I think we're going to rebrand the name, but under the hood, more and more infrastructure is going to be around MCP. So the last thing I want to talk about in this next slide is the strategic playbook. So when you start looking at how you can address some of these issues in your own business or your own enterprise, the first thing you should probably do is look at an audit and see what your current AI spend is. Most orders don't actually know, right? Like there's not a good way to query this, and there's definitely not a good way to query it across multiple different proprietary systems. And so being able to identify what that actual spend is really important. I would say then to identify 3 to 5 use cases that you might be able to use in open source or a smaller language model, where you have like a very specific task that you're doing, and it might be very high volume. The second would be do a pilot to see if you can actually bring in some of those AI features into your user experience and see, is there a need or a way to leverage JavaScript to handle any kind of like latency sensitive features. And then the last would be building your own MCP server so that you can actually use that as a governance framework to actually leverage some of the security debt that you might have. So with that, this is my prediction for 2026. I feel like we're moving in this direction. Things are moving really quickly, but these are the things that I'll be focusing on as I start my journey through this year. Thanks.